In this tutorial, we are going to paint with gouache our try at replicating this reference photo. So it's a sunset with some ocean waves lapping in the foreground, and I am using Arteza gouache here in a variety of colors. So I have some greens and some blues, and then some light orange blush colors, as well as white and gray. And we're going to use all of these to create this kind of sunrise effect on the water. So first, we're going to start with the sky. And while I'm taping this down, I want to say this isn't meant to be like a here's how you paint the ocean kind of thing. This is more of I painted this, I recorded it, and this is my narration explaining kind of how I did it. So if you find that to be interesting, then feel free to keep watching. First, I taped off the section of the sky. I'm using in this painting gouache, but I'm using it both as watercolor and as acrylic. So to paint the first part of the sky, I got the sky wet with clean water, and then I added the gouache on top of the wet paint, and that is what's called using the wet on wet technique. So it allows the paint to blend in naturally together. So I added some blues, some lighter blues first and then darker blues on top, and then I did that about 2/3 of the way down from the top of the sky portion, and then I cleaned off my water, cleaned off my brush, and with some clean water just kind of blended in the bottom of that gradient, that blue gradient, in a little bit more before I added the orange. And then I made the sky a little textured a bit also with my paintbrush there. And I did that before I added the orange because blue and orange are complementary colors. So before I add that pale orange, I don't want the colors to mix too much. And so that's why I diluted it. Now I'm using my paintbrush to create kind of a sun ray effect. And in order to create the sun rays in the sky with the wet on wet technique, you need a clean brush, and then you need to wash off, like blot off most of the water on a paper towel so that your brush is like damp. It's what's called a thirsty brush when it's wet but not very wet. It's mostly just damp with no drops or anything, and then you can use that clean brush to lift paint from the paper, allowing the white to show through. So after I did that, now I'm laying down some of the pinks and oranges for the sunset or sunrise, whatever you think it is. For this effect, it's important to note, especially when I'm painting skies in watercolor, that I try not to worry too much about getting it exactly right. I try not to worry too much about making sure that the sky is perfect, especially where the sunlight is, mostly because I know that, the sunrise isn't quote unquote perfect either. It's the whole point of light and how it's beautiful is it just kind of goes everywhere in the most mysterious way. And so if you let your paint also have that mysterious quality, the wet on wet technique especially allows you to do that. So one thing I did do though is leave a little white space where I painted around, and that is to represent the brightness of the sun. So with my paintbrush, I'm just using the reference photo as a guide, obviously. So maybe I'm painting a little bit of color around the sun to help provide some contrast there, and then using clean water to blend that color in so it's not quite as stark. I know that sounds like two opposing actions, but painting is not, sometimes it's just kind of you do what you feel, So that's what I'm doing here. Going back and forth between my round brush and my flat brush to add in color sometimes and to mess it around. So it's important to note here as I take off the tape that my camera stopped recording when I painted the clouds. I know that's really frustrating, but I will definitely paint another tutorial where I paint clouds with gouache. But basically what I did was wait for the sky to dry, and then I used gouache on dry paper, not like watercolor, but more like acrylic, in order to paint the clouds. And like I said, in another tutorial I will go more in depth of how I painted those clouds. I wish that it had recorded. It didn't, and I am just as bummed about it as you are. But the main event in this painting, I think, is the water anyway, so I am excited to move along to the water portion. I, as you can see, got the bottom part wet first, and I'm using the wet on wet technique and using gouache as watercolor here. As you can see, sometimes I'm using some of the wet gouache that I had, but I also had some dried gouache that I'm re-wetting in order to use similar to watercolor in my ocean. And when you're painting the ocean, the most important thing is to try to make out some of the shapes and make kind of that wave motion, that wave shape in a few places on your water. And so because this is a base, I know I'm going to be painting over it. I'm painting on top of it with the gouache, and I'm going to use the gouache more like acrylic for the second layer. So my first layer is kind of more like me laying down guidelines for where I think the waves are going to go, and where the different colors are supposed to be as well. The tricky thing about water is so difficult to paint because it has so many colors. There's so many things going on, and it's not, you can't control it, and you can't control it in nature either, right? It just kind of is all over the place and does what it wants. And so trying to mimic that is difficult because how do you paint something that is wild and unruly in the first place? And my biggest trick is to just let go of your need for control, let go of your need for perfection, and B, let go of the idea that you're trying to paint water, and instead just try to nail down, figure out a couple basic shapes. And especially if you're using a reference photo, to only point out a few of the shapes and not try to do it all perfectly exactly right. So the big shape that I'm trying to paint is right in front. There's kind of a rolling wave, and as we go along, you'll see that I don't quite match this reference photo perfectly, but that's okay. So I'm just trying to figure out where the shapes are and where the colors go, and putting the colors where they go. And I know that sounds really rudimentary, but I don't really know how else to explain it. And like I said, this isn't really meant to be a how to paint water tutorial because I'm still figuring out how to teach that in the first place. This is just me showing you my touch and go process for painting this ocean. So after the watercolor portion had dried, all of this layer is with gouache in its paste form. And I am going back and forth between the reference photo and where I'm painting, and painting light spaces where I think they need to be, and painting dark spaces where it looks like they need to be. And the movements are important here because I know that's the hardest part about water, is it's moving all over the place. It's not all just the same movement. And so how do you capture that? I try not to worry about that too much. And like I said, just try to capture it correctly, or try to mostly capture it in some places. So in the back corner, the back left-hand corner, it looks like they're kind of small-ish waves. And so I'm painting a couple small-ish waves. And then in that big wave in front there, it's more of a triangle shape kind of wave where different streams of water that are different colors. Some are light and some are darker, where the sun is reflecting and then where it's in shadow. And those are more diagonal lines that are pointing up to the crest of the wave in the middle of the painting. And then in the bottom right-hand corner, there's another little kind of ripple or wave that I'm trying to just mimic the shape of. And it's a really tough I know, to look at water like that and make sense of how everything goes. And so I feel like this YouTube video is a lot of me saying, just don't worry about it and do what you can. And I hope that that is enough to help you give it a try. I'm also going to say that the first time I tried painting water was a complete mess, and I gave up for about a year before I tried again because I just couldn't make sense of it. And but I've discovered that the more I do it, the more I have the courage to try again, and the more I learn, if that makes sense. So I did that with white and blue, tried to like mimic the shape of these waves and put in just random streaks of color, either in that long diagonal line or in the classic wave shape. And then once I felt like I had a decent enough foundation for the ocean, that's when I picked up kind of the sunset colors. And so I picked up pink first, and I put down the pink in kind of like a loose, flowy zigzag, because that kind of shape, the zigzag wave shape, is the one that helped click the most for me in terms of how to paint light reflecting off of water, because it's not going to reflect in a straight line because the water is moving, right? It's going to reflect in kind of that zigzag, ripply kind of way, and the light is going to show up in places that you might not expect it to. So just do your best, and if what you paint comes out different from whatever reference photo you're working on, if you're following along with me and using the same reference photo that I pulled from Unsplash or trying something else, just do your best and to follow that like zigzag pattern, and lean into being imperfect. Lean into making a mess of things, because that's really, sometimes you think that you're making too much of a mess and you like there's no way to fix it. But when you take a step back, it actually is kind of falling into place, and it was supposed to be messy in the first place. So anyway, after I painted some of the sunset, the sunlight reflecting off of the ocean, I went back to some of the waves to add in lighter spots and darker spots in that kind of ripply diagonal line motion, as you can see. And for a lot of these lines, I'm using my smaller flat brush, and I think that was a little bit easier to maneuver than my really large flat brush, especially as I was trying to add in some of these details. So it's important to note when you're trying to paint waves or the ocean that you need both light and dark, because what makes you be able to see the water moving is the ripples in the water, with the light reflecting in different spots and it being cast in shadow in different spots. And so you need both light and dark, and using a reference photo can help in that way, but mostly it's important to note that both of them are important to have when you're trying to paint water. And so I'm adding a few more ripples, a few more dark ripples in places in that classic wave shape, and then sometimes in just like a zigzag wavy shape as well. And then I'm adding some more light in that lighter orange color, mostly in that wavy zigzag line in the middle, but also in a few spots on the wave, like in the bottom left-hand corner as well. And I'm just kind of going with the flow here, and I know that might be frustrating to hear, but hopefully if you've made it this long in the YouTube video, it wasn't enough to deter you, because I feel like that's mostly what's happening with a lot of this video in the first place. So I added a bunch of white to the big wave on the bottom left-hand side that's moving up to the crest, like in the middle of the foreground. And because I noticed that it got a little too dark, and one of the main color schemes of that wave in the reference photo is that there are a lot of light spots in there. There's a lot of light reflecting off of it. And so if ever I felt like something wasn't quite right, referring back to the reference photo to see how much light and how much dark I had is something that helped. And then just kind of adding random squiggle spots as I was going along. And at some point, I remember in this painting feeling like I wasn't exactly sure where to go. I wasn't exactly sure if it was even a success. And so I took a step back and looked at it for a long while. And that really helped for me to figure out where to go next. So I added a few more white ripples, and at some point here, I also cleaned off my paintbrush and blended in a few of the ripples as I was going along. One important thing to note about gouache is, similar to oil paint, you can rework it after it's already on the page. That unlike watercolor, when watercolor dries, it adheres to the paper. Like you can't really rework it again, which is an important trait for watercolor because layers of transparency in watercolor are really important. But for gouache, you can rework it, and so that because it's opaque and you don't have to worry so much about, I mean, layers are important, but you don't have to worry so much because you can always just add a layer on top to cover any mistakes that you've made. And so you can blend things with a clean brush after you've already painted, and that is what I'm doing right now. I'm just kind of blending in some of the wave shapes so they're not quite so distinct, so that I have all of the colors still. I'm still maintaining a lot of the loose shapes, but by blending it more into the ocean, blending it more into the piece, it kind of feels more like water and less like a bunch of random colorful lines all put together, if that makes sense. So that's what's happening right now, and that was kind of, I mean, I don't want to say a revelation to me, but I mean, it kind of was. So that's what's going on here. And like every artist, I, kept taking a step back and then adding a few things here or there, a few more white spots, and then blending them in with clean water, a few more dark wave spots, and then blending them in with clean water. And then at some point, I just needed to be done. And I felt really proud of this piece because it's not perfect, but I also did my best and used a lot of the techniques that I've been honing over the past couple years to create a water piece that I feel looks pretty cool. So once again, this was not really meant to be a tutorial like this is how to paint this, because I don't think this is a lesson that's cohesive so much as just showing you how I painted it. And I make courses. I am a person who enjoys making tutorials, and so I wouldn't want to, have you think that this is exactly the way that I make tutorials that I've already outlined in my head. But I hope that you enjoyed listening to my commentary anyway, and I hope you enjoyed watching this piece come together. It was one of my favorites that I've ever painted. And yeah, so thank you for watching. If you like this video and want to see more, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments, and I will see you next time.